Can your employer really require you to get a COVID vaccine as a condition of employment? As an employee rights lawyer for decades now, I've been fighting for employees who are being discriminated against, treated differently, harassed, wrongfully discharged. So I am on your side. That's what I do for a living. There are times, however, when it comes to things like the vaccine mandate, where it's just really not that simple. And so if you stick around till the end of this brief talk, I will give you some tips on how to potentially be excused, at least temporarily, from the requirements of getting the COVID vaccine, and perhaps permanently if you fit into one of the few categories that may allow you to refuse the COVID vaccine. But first, a little update. So the Biden administration last week authorized and now has ordered the Occupational and Safety and Health Administration of the United States to enforce COVID vaccine mandates for all federal employers and for all private employers in the United States with at least 100 employees. If you work for a private company with at least 100 employees, you will, going forward, need to either show that you have been vaccinated, either at work or through an independent vaccine provider, or undergo weekly testing. Now, keep in mind that Americans are pretty united in support and favor of the COVID vaccine. At least 75% of adult Americans now have taken at least one shot of the coronavirus vaccine. Yet, COVID has killed 660,000 Americans so far. That's roughly the entire population of Boston, Massachusetts, and every day it's still killing 1,500 more people each and every day. So this country is in the midst of a really big vaccine push for the public health and safety, just as we've done in the past with smallpox, polio, whooping cough, measles, etc. Now, also to note, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, these COVID vaccines have been proven safe, protective, and 95% effective in decreasing hospitalizations and deaths, at least those of us who are under 65 years of age. And even above 65 years of age, the protective rate, the effective rate is 80% plus. But yet, this virus is so vicious that we need more than a 75% buy-in rate. We need to increase that so that it stops killing 5,500 Americans a day in all 50 states. So how do we get that social consensus up above 75% to get where we need to go from where we are? So the administration's new mandatory vaccine push is a step in the right direction, as it will affect tens of millions of people because COVID isn't defeated yet. One would also think, I note, that if you're against mandatory lockdowns and mandatory masking, you should be super in favor of vaccines, right? Because you're either sort of pro-COVID or anti-COVID, and those are the ways for us to tackle this major, once-in-a-century health crisis that we're all experiencing and has affected all of us in one way or another, affecting our life. So now the U.S. Occupational Safety and Health Administration will be in a position, they're greatly understaffed, and it's anyone's guess how they're going to accomplish it at this point, but the rules itself may incentivize and push companies and employees to get the COVID vaccine that may save their own or their families or their neighbors or their parents or grandparents, or protect their children's lives ultimately. And just before I get into the potential methods for you to attempt to not get vaccinated and stand up to your company's mandatory vaccine, just keep in mind the following. Before you're able to join the military, or a loved one can join the military and start boot camp, you have to undergo and take a slew of vaccines. Everything from measles, mumps, rubella, hepatitis A, hepatitis B, pneumonia, influenza, tetanus, chickenpox, polio, meningitis, HPV, and others I'm not thinking of at the moment. And before you can enter school in all 50 states in the United States, and it's been this way for more than 40 years, your child has to take even more vaccines than that. It may be 16 or 17 to keep your child and his classmates and you safe, right, from these formerly deadly diseases. It's the same thing that's now going on with COVID. So we don't really have a right, just like we don't have a right to drink and drive or right not to wear a seatbelt because it inhibits our freedom. We don't really have a built-in right to say, it's my body and I don't want to put this into my body because it's just the way I feel about it, I'm nervous, or what have you. That won't make a compelling legal argument to your employer or in court if you're terminated for not taking the COVID vaccine, or for just being willing to test weekly if you're that adamant about it. So let me, though, talk about the few ways that an employee can, in good conscience and good faith, attempt to indicate to one's employer that I am not going to bend to this vaccine requirement, and I shouldn't have to because of the following. One exception would be to a disability that you have that would endanger you if you took the vaccine. And usually the danger in taking the vaccine should be worse or greater danger than the danger of getting the virus and what that would do to your health and the health of others. Now, if you have certain medical conditions that would preclude you from taking the vaccine for whatever those reasons are, an immunodeficiency of some kind, you're in a treatment, perhaps for cancer, if you have some exceptional current challenge, medical challenge that scientifically, medically, your physician can prove, can state, you shouldn't be taking this vaccine either forever or for a period of time during this course of treatment or until and unless you heal, that requires your employer to take that under account, have this discussion, this process with you, review your medical documentation, and talk amongst themselves and then with you again to determine your needs, the needs of the individual, you, not to take a vaccine, versus the needs of the many, the company. And typically the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one. On the other hand, if you have, even if it's something like severe anxiety that's documented by a mental health care worker around vaccines, etc., perhaps your company will say, for you, we understand that, and at least until another year or 6 months or the pandemic has passed, we will permit you to work from home, for example, or to work alone with a mask in this particular space. But your company does have to go through the motions of this so-called interactive process to determine whether or not they will allow you to be an exception to the COVID vaccine mandate, or whether they will say it's an undue hardship on us and your explanation really doesn't rise to the level of what's needed for us to grant that exception because too many others may come forward and say, oh, I'm just as nervous about getting the vaccine, etc. Now, if you're pregnant, because that's a temporary disability while you're pregnant, if your obstetrician writes a note to say that during this gestational cycle you should not be vaccinated, also a good reason and excuse to put forth so that your company must have that balanced conversation with you to determine for another 6 months until your baby is born, we will permit you to not get vaccinated and work from home, for example. Although I'll note, and you'll check with your own OB, many doctors still will say the risk of COVID to you and your unborn baby is far greater than the risk, which really have not been shown yet throughout all the vaccinations of pregnant women, to be dangerous to the mother or the unborn child. But pregnancy is one of those accommodation-worthy events, particularly because it is brief, that your employer must take into account if right now you, your family, and your physician doesn't believe it would be in you or your baby's best interest to take the vaccine. And finally, religion. Religion, I mean, there are times like in New York State now, if you're a healthcare worker, the religious exemption for an accommodation allowing you to avoid the vaccine, completely suspended. But religion, a sincerely held religious belief, may be enough to have your employer do that same accommodation test, your needs, your beliefs versus the public health and safety and company safety, and are they willing to permit you that exemption? And if so, to what extent, etc. But I'll add again that most organized religions have no anti-vaccine platform to argue against or about. So to come up with a sincerely held religious belief that's supported by your clergy may not be as easy as it seems. You just can't say it's against my deeply held religious convictions. You'd have to explain that further and show why your particular sincerely held religious beliefs would preclude you from taking a vaccine that is likely in your best interest notwithstanding and the interests of the company. If you have questions about your particular situation in the workplace as it relates to vaccines, or your pregnancy, or any disability, please give us a call, email us, and we will evaluate your case confidentially and with no charge to you. Take care now. Stay safe.